Hi everyone, welcome to your mini lecture for Module 7, and here we're going to talk about evaluation of school-based practice. First, I want to get started by talking a little bit about the distinction or some of the differences between evaluation and assessment. So we've already talked about assessment, and in some ways what we talk about here is not going to be entirely new because a lot of the tools and kind of methods that we might use to collect data for an assessment, we might use also to conduct evaluation. So the difference is really our intent. Assessment informs planning, right? Assessment is not necessarily a one-time thing. Assessment is an ongoing process. We get to know a client, whether it's a student or a whole school or a community. Right? We assess, we collect data, we synthesize that data to formulate some kind of a plan, right? And then we continue collecting data to let us know, is our plan working, right? Is it appropriate, or do we need to change? So assessment is ongoing. This little graphic here is kind of useful, though it's actually referring to the distinctions between assessment and evaluation of students, like for teachers or instructors, right? But I still think it's useful for us in terms of thinking of clients. Assessment is ongoing. It's positive, meaning it's meant to be not saying you failed, but to say what can we do, right, to move things forward. It's individualized, right? It should be tailored to that client. It provides feedback, right? Evaluation, on the other hand, provides some kind of closure. It is judgmental in the sense that it reflects an outcome, right? It might be applied against standard or a goal, and it might show if we didn't reach that goal. So evaluation is going to be more outcome oriented, right? Now, we might evaluate something and realize that we need to modify our intervention as a result. We get to the end of a 6-week intervention and we're kind of doing a final evaluation or review. We were collecting data in that time and kind of using that, but our final assessment of outcome might say, no, the student didn't reach the goal. We go back and we kind of reassess, reformulate the goals. So evaluation, ideally we're always reaching goals, but that may not always be the case. Sometimes we will not get to where we hoped to be. But evaluation is a measure of our outcomes, right? What was the impact of that intervention or of that work? So both use measures, both are data driven. They might use exactly the same measures. The question is whether you're using it to inform intervention and planning, or whether you're using it to evaluate progress, to evaluate the effectiveness of intervention, to evaluate the effectiveness of your practice. Okay? So assessment, baseline measurements, and it's ongoing. Evaluation, outcomes. But they may actually be the same tools, just depends on where we're using it. So when we're talking about evaluation, what are different types? We might evaluate student or individual outcomes, right? So we're working with a student. We want to monitor their progress toward a goal or measure the effectiveness of a plan that we have for that student or an intervention we're doing with that particular, like for that student. Not a measure of the effectiveness of the intervention generally, but for that student, okay? We might also do school-wide or large group outcomes evaluation. So we might be looking at discipline data across the school, or we might be picking a group. We want to see how our African American students are performing as a group, or are they being targeted? Are they more disproportionate recipients of punitive discipline, right? Those types of things. So those are kind of large group or school-wide data. We might look at school climate, right, data as a school social worker. How many students report feeling safe across school? How many report feeling unsafe, feeling welcome, right? Do they see their culture reflected in the school? Those are things that are often evaluated in school climate measures. And again, the difference between a needs assessment, where we might look at these things in order to inform an intervention, and an evaluation is when we're doing it, right? So we may have been working for a long time on some efforts, some social emotional learning or some trauma-informed practices that are meant to improve our school climate. We want to know, did they work? What was the outcome? Then we would evaluate. We might, excuse me, also do program evaluation, right? Asking the question, does X program work? So maybe not a whole school-wide approach to reform or a whole kind of series of different efforts, but this particular program, this particular intervention, is it effective? This might involve more of a research type of design. So we might want to say, hey, I want to start trying CBITS, kind of behavioral intervention in schools, right? Or for trauma in schools. I want to do CBITS with my high schoolers. We want to see, is it effective with this particular group in this demographic setting in this region, okay? So we might try it. I normally have 20 students who are probably appropriate for that intervention who've been impacted by trauma. I'm going to find a group of 5 with whom I do CBITS, Maybe the other 15 we do what we usually do. Let's see how the 5 progress compared to the other students. So you might pilot an intervention with a particular group. We might have certain teachers doing a particular social emotional learning program, and we're going to see what is the impact of that program or that intervention. And then as school social workers, you're probably going to be expected to be involved in some kind of evaluation of your practice. And if you're not asked to do it, you should do it, because very often one of the key barriers, if you remember back early on we talked about school social work roles, is that very often people don't know what the school social worker does or what they are doing. And so it's often our role to demonstrate that. Here's what I have been doing. And so we can evaluate our practice by monitoring the reach and impact of social work intervention, reporting, how many cases that are we supporting, kind of what is our caseload and what does it look like, or also reporting outcomes, right? Here's what I did and here were the outcomes. So in that case, we're evaluating all the aspects of the work that we do kind of holistically, and might do some reporting on that. So we'll start with student outcomes to talk a little bit more in depth. As you will have done in your behavior intervention plan, we want to plan for evaluation early, right? If we set out a plan or an intervention and we don't know how we're going to measure success, we're going to be scrambling at the end and we're not really going to know whether or not it was effective. So we want to define at the outset, what would it look like if it was effective? What's a reasonable goal? Attainable goal, a reasonable outcome that we would expect from this particular intervention, and how will we measure it? Who's going to keep that data? Is it a log? Is it observations? Is it a pre and post tool? And who's going to do it, right? So plan for that early. We want to operationalize the concern. So we've been talking a lot about this, right? We don't want to just say so-and-so is disruptive. What does it look like, right? Joseph engages in behaviors in which he is up and out of his seat 80% of the time. We want him to be able to stay in his seat during work or to go to a self-selected appropriate spot at least 50% of the time, right? And how are we going to do that? Social worker is going to come observe, teacher is going to log, whatever it is. So we plan for that data collection and review. So review, we're going to look at this in 6 weeks, in 8 weeks, right? A time that there's enough time for the intervention to work, but not so long that the student's going to languish if it's not working. And again, a reasonable outcome. So if Joseph is out of his seat 80% of the time, he's only kind of seated and on task 20% of the time, it would be unreasonable to expect that he's going to switch that and suddenly be 80% of the time on task, right? With a reasonable amount of growth. Kind of when we talked about that, a desired alternative behavior could be another reasonable outcome, right? Last thing you want to think about when we measure student outcomes is when we're looking at the evaluation data, we want to be able to distinguish between a lack of fidelity and a lack of effect. What do I mean by that? Fidelity is whether or not the intervention we said was going to happen actually happened and happened the way it's supposed to. So if we put a behavior plan in place that says teacher's going to do this, they're going to prompt student in this way, they're going to respond to the problem behavior in this way, student's going to earn X, Y, and Z reward, everyone's going to do their different pieces of the plan. We want to make sure that actually happened, right? If we see that the student was not successful, we have to ask the question, was it because the plan didn't work or because the plan didn't happen, right? If the plan didn't happen, or even if the plan was an intervention with the social worker and you were not able to do it with fidelity, right? Maybe you were doing CBITS, which means that they're supposed to meet weekly, and that student was absent for 6 out of the 8 sessions, right? There's a lack of fidelity there. So if there's a lack of fidelity, we ask why. Right? Why? What happened? Was it that the team, the teacher, whoever didn't remember the plan, that they needed more support, right? Was it that they're not on board, they don't really buy into the plan, and so they're not going to do it? Was it that the student was absent? So we need to think about that separately. And then that's going to inform whether we want to keep going with that intervention or modify it. So, we may make a decision to say, hey, you know what? We were just kind of off these few weeks, but we still really believe in this. We buy in. We have the support we need to have this plan happen. Let's keep going, but let's all revisit how we can support one another to make it happen. Or we might have a frank conversation and say, all right, teacher, you know what? We realized that it wasn't feasible, what we were asking you to do. So let's rethink some other ways that we could get the same impact. Or, again, attendance is an issue. And so we may need to look at how can we make sure that the student gets the CBITS intervention when they're there. Or maybe we need to think about additional supports to support their attendance, because no intervention is going to be effective if they're not there. So if we can actually see that there's a lack of effect, we want to modify the intervention though. So if we can see that they've come to CBITS every week, they finish the program, there's been no change, we don't just say, see you, goodbye, right? We still need to keep doing something. We modify the intervention. If a student was at a tier 2, we bump them up. We give more support. If they're at a tier 3, we change what that support looks like. But remember, not too soon, right? Change takes time, and we need to look for incremental progress as well. So, if it's been 2 weeks, the teacher's saying, I don't see anything different, right? The student I had, for example, that couldn't be in the classroom for more than 10 minutes without kind of a physical altercation. Well, he's still having an altercation every day. Well, it's been 2 weeks. He's gone from 6 altercations a day to 1. Let's not change the intervention yet, right? We're seeing some progress. We want to give it a little bit more time. Students need to experience success. All people need to experience success. It's fundamental to behavior change. And so we need to experience success. We need opportunities to practice and be reinforced in order to make meaningful change. Some examples of measurement for kind of individual student interventions or plans. We might do pre and post observation. So we've talked before about time on task or tallying behaviors, things like that. You might do some longitudinal tracking. So, the student I had that couldn't be in the classroom for more than 10 minutes without something really significant happening. It used to happen every hour. After 6 weeks is down to once a day. So, we're not just tallying in an observation period, but tallying throughout the day and over the course of a few weeks. You might use pre and post scales, whether they're validated scales or just a simple thing like, hey, I'm going to do a social skills group where we're going to work on initiating play, asking someone to play, playing a game, and ending a game when I'm not interested anymore appropriately. Can he do those 3 things before? Teacher gives him a rating. We work on it for 5 or 6 weeks in lunch group. Can he do it now? Right? They can be really simple. Or student self-report, right? So you might have students rate themselves when we're talking about different concerns. And there's a really great book called The Incredible 5-Point Scale. I copied it. It looks like this. This is a quick page from it. But the book basically shows us how we can use a 5-point scale for anything. So it can raise student awareness. So this is an example of kind of an intervention, right, where the student kind of learns how to rate themselves. How angry am I? But then we might work with the student to say, all right, let's use our scale. This week, how much do you think you were at were you at a 3 most of the time or a 2 most of the time when you were in that class? Kind of, did your anger over time decrease, right? And they can actually describe what the different levels look like themselves. So it's what we actually call goal attainment scaling or a self-anchored rating scale. The student themselves describes what would it look like if I was at a 5, what would it look like if I was at a 1, and then we use that to rate them. So they might rate that every week for you, or we might rate that at the beginning, when you get really mad, what do you do now? And then at the end, what would it look like if you were managing your anger better? So you can use those types of scales. School-wide or group outcomes look a little bit different. So I'm going to use kind of case examples to explain what these types of evaluation might look like. So let's imagine John Lewis Elementary has been working to implement trauma-informed practices across the school. So this kind of school-wide intervention that they're doing. They want to know if the efforts are paying off. How would we evaluate this? So the first question, this is actually really important because sometimes schools implement these things. They don't really know what the outcomes they're looking for are. So the first question is, what was the goal of these efforts? Why did we implement trauma-informed practices? What were we expecting to see? Were we going to see discipline referrals reduced? Were we going to see students improve their academic performance, improve their social emotional learning or social emotional functioning? Were we going to expect to see students and staff happier? I mean, that's a real meaningful outcome. Reduction in disproportionate disciplinary action. And all of this means we might need multifaceted data to answer this question. So we want to answer early on, again, what do we expect to see when we do these things? So we'll measure those same things to evaluate it. And especially in these kind of school-wide outcomes, we probably want to pull multiple data sets. If we look only at a reduction in discipline referrals, that might tell us something. It also might tell us that teachers just stopped referring students to the office, which can be good. It might mean that they're handling things proactively and supportively, or it might just mean that they gave up because they feel like the office doesn't help anyway. So we want to collect multiple measures to say, is it what we actually thought it was going to be? And how might we measure fidelity, right? We also want to know, did it really happen? So if we train teachers to respond in a certain way when discipline concerns arise, how do we know that that's what's happening? Are we going to observe? Do we have other systems for data to look at? Here's an example of some school-wide data, or kind of different indicators. So this is social emotional learning, a school's implementing school-wide social emotional learning. They have these different pillars or indicators. These are the things that they would expect to see. So you might, as a team and a social worker as part of that team, say, all right, we're implementing this really comprehensive social emotional learning program. All right, here's the things that would tell us that it's happening. We would see explicit SEL instruction. So how are we going to know, how are we going to measure that it's actually happening? Okay, we're going to walk around and, from 9 to 9:30, that's SEL time. We're going to notice that classes are doing it or not. Is it integrated in academic instruction? Maybe the principal is going to look in lesson plans for that. Right, we move down. So we might identify a particular indicator, a piece of data for each one, and then our evaluation would synthesize all of that. And again, this is probably the type of evaluation that you might do as part of a team, but hopefully the social worker would be part of it. Program evaluation. So again, this is maybe looking at a specific intervention, a specific curriculum, something like that, that you're implementing and seeing is it effective. So let's go back to John Lewis Elementary. Part of their trauma-informed practices, they utilized a curriculum or a intervention called Bounce Back, which is basically CBITS for younger kids. As part of their efforts to build trauma-informed practices, 20 students at Tier 2 and 3 were referred by their parents or their caregiver for participation. 12 of those 20 students completed the intervention. We want to know, is Bounce Back effective? Should we do that for all of our students who would qualify for it? So, right, what would the outcomes be? Right? So we might again see increased kind of using a rating scale to measure kind of their social emotional functioning, maybe discipline referrals or reported discipline concerns from their teachers, maybe a student self-report, right, on how they're feeling or how they're doing in school. So we might look at those outcomes for the students who completed the intervention, and then we want to see, well, does that differ from any other students? So one way to do that is to look at non-participating but similar peers. In this particular example, we had 20 students who were referred, but only 10 completed the intervention, or 12, completed the intervention. So we have 8 students who were probably appropriate for the intervention but didn't complete it. It makes kind of a nice control group, right? So let's assume that those 8 never showed up. Did not participate at all, but they were referred. We might look at their same outcomes and compare them to say, okay, what does Bounce Back do? We have kind of a nice control group. The difficult thing about, real meaningful research in schools is that it's not ethical most of the time to withhold interventions. It's really hard to actually have randomized controlled trials. So things like this, where you have a wait list or we have students who say they're going to participate and then don't, those can be useful ways to get control groups when otherwise we might not have one. And again, we might use multifaceted data to look at this program. So, not just its impact on discipline referrals, but what do students say about it? Right, their own functioning, what do teachers say about their functioning, maybe what do other data sources say about them. This is an example of a program evaluation oriented towards teachers. So Trauma Smart is a kind of year-long trauma-informed practices training, kind of professional development approach. And so they did their training for their teachers. They engaged with their teachers over the course of the year. We want to know, is this effective at actually changing, excuse me, teacher attitudes towards trauma-informed care. So these are different elements of teacher attitude toward trauma-informed care measured by a scale called the Arctic. They had teachers use the take the Arctic before. They have teachers take the Arctic after. And then we see some increase over time in their attitudes towards trauma-informed care. If you want to see more about these evaluation results here, but program evaluation, right? We want to see, did that particular approach to professional development do anything for teachers? And the last thing we want to talk about is evaluation of practice. So, kind of this core question of what makes a school social worker effective. And hopefully that takes you back to where we started, which was asking, what's our job and our role in the first place? So that's going to define how we see effectiveness, right? There's different ways. If we have a very clinical model, we might see effectiveness by, kind of reporting on our caseload, right? I carry a caseload of 50 students, 30 students. It varies. 30 is probably an average to low average range. 30 students on my caseload that I see regularly. Here were the outcomes for those students in terms of their IEP goals, right? That might be one kind of concrete way to report. One thing to think about is, we might want to be able to demonstrate our value to our administrators. And so noting how many students are reached by social work services matters, but important to know that the more clinical your model for intervention, the fewer students you can reach. sometimes that needs to be the case because we need to do some intensive work individually with students. But if we insist on only seeing students individually, we're going to be inherently limited in who we can support. So it's important to kind of think about that and balance that. So how many students are reached? We might also ask, how are actually students impacted? Are their IEP goals met? Do they respond to interventions? If maybe it's not an IEP goal, but we're doing some tiered behavior interventions, how many students are we able to kind of support at tier 2 and they don't have to go any further, right? That's great. What do students and families report about the services that are provided? Right, that's important too. Are there partnerships that are really meaningful by, for families or for staff? How are staff in the school as a whole impacted by social work presence and support? So we might even think about, again, our colleagues and kind of what it means, not just to provide direct services to students in schools, but what it means to be a social work presence in a school. How do the rest of the staff utilize and benefit from consultation or access to us? Do administration trust and seek your opinion, right? What role does the social work play in school-wide initiatives? How do we support holistic student development, right? So how do we kind of use our training, our knowledge, our values, and our skills in those broader ways? You'll see in the module there are some models and kind of templates for social worker evaluation. A lot of times in schools, social workers end up being evaluated by the same rubric they use to evaluate teachers. It gets very confusing. Like I used to have to submit these weird lesson plan pre and post, and teachers would observe, or principals would observe me doing a lesson in a classroom. It really didn't reflect the work I did. So if we end up in this field, we want to think about, is it part of our role perhaps to provide some kind of report documentation, something, our own evaluation of our practice, to inform those folks who may not be as informed about what it is that we do and can do, about all of the good work that we're doing, in addition to whatever it might be that our district is already using. I'm going to leave you with one quick extra credit opportunity. So for up to 2 points of extra credit, I want you to take a minute. We don't have an assignment for this module particularly. Hopefully you're working on your final assignment right now, but you can get 2 points of extra credit if you take a minute to email me with a quick description of your understanding of the various ways in which school social workers engage or could engage, should engage in evaluation. And can you identify any potential barriers to this happening, right? As you can see, evaluation is really important. It's often overlooked. And so if you can email me with a couple of thoughts about, what types of evaluation did we talk about here and what might be some barriers, I'm happy to add that in to your final assignment as extra credit. As always, email me with any questions.